Hey, Owen here, and today I'm going to be building Mirage Hobby's 1/48 scale PZL P11c. Mirage Hobby provided me with this kit, and Deluxe Materials provided me with their perfect plastic putty for free. However, neither company have paid me or told me what to do or say. Before starting, I washed all the parts in warm soapy water with a splash of vinegar. This was to remove any residue left over from the moulding process. I painted the interior parts while they were still on the sprue with the Humbrol colours indicated on screen. First, I attached the photo etch flooring to the plastic with superglue. The instructions suggested that rudder pedals should be made from stretched pieces of sprue, and this put me off trying to create them. Looking back, I could have made them from thin card or paper. To allow the poly cement glue to bond the parts, I made sure that the contact areas were clear of paint before applying the glue. There was a very small photo etch instrument panel that I bent into shape using pliers and tweezers. The detail in the panel was added with a piece of printed plastic, the back of which I painted fluorescent yellow. The detail was then glued to the photo etch. I applied the superglue with a matchstick to control the amount applied. I used blue tack or Plastitack to secure the seat in place, ready to attach the photo etch seat belts. I applied a small amount of superglue to each seat belt, waited for it to dry fully before moving on to the next one. When they were both attached, I bent the photo etch into position, clamping them with a clip to prevent them from breaking off. Once in position, I secured them with some more superglue. The harness was more difficult to do and required a lot of care and patience to get it into the right position. This little lever was difficult to attach because the part was curved. I sanded the contact area flat to make it easier to glue in place. I painted the cockpit sides with the Humbrol colours indicated on screen. A test fit of the fuselage halves showed that they were slightly warped. I cut off the alignment pins because I thought they might be the problem, but that didn't help. I realised there was a small amount of flashing around the edges, so I ran my scalpel along them to remove it. This seemed to nearly fix the problem. The machine guns were glued in place with poly cement glue. To accentuate the shadows, the cockpit was given a dark grey acrylic wash. The main instrument panel again had a clear piece for the detail, the back of which was painted fluorescent yellow. The attitude indicator had to be bent very carefully with tweezers. The detail was again added with a clear piece painted yellow on the back. Unfortunately, when attaching it to the main panel, the superglue fogged the clear plastic. It would have been safer to use PVA glue, as this could have been cleaned up and wouldn't have caused a fogging effect. I glued the cockpit into the fuselage, but the arrow on the instructions was not very clear and I attached it under the marker. I've indicated the correct positioning on screen. This meant that the seat was too low and didn't line up with the headrest. I didn't realise this until later, by which time the problem couldn't be fixed. After I attached the instrument panel, I discovered it would not fit between the two fuselage halves. I sanded as much as I could off one side without going through the plastic, but it still wouldn't fit. Sadly, when pressing the sides together, the panel got bent. I've heard other people have experienced this problem too. It was a shame that the detail was good, but the fit was not. The fuselage halves were secured in place with clips and masking tape while the glue dried. I sanded down some flashing on the inside of the wings to get a better fit, then glued the lower halves in place. Tamiya extra thin cement was used to seal any small gaps in the fuselage and along the wings. It's the first time I've used it and it's amazing. It gets sucked into the gaps to seal them without making a mess. The kit comes with the option of building the early version with 2 machine guns or the later version with a radio and 4 machine guns, 2 of which are mounted in the wings. I decided to build the later version. Holes for the guns were opened with a pin vise. Injection ports for the bullet casings were added. The join seam along the wings was neatened with a scalpel and then sanded with a piece of 600 grit, then 1000 grit sandpaper to get a smooth finish. Using my scalpel, I removed some of the moulded detail that was to be replaced with photo etch parts. The join seam between the two fuselage halves was neatened with a scalpel, then sanded with 600, then 1000 grit sandpaper to get a smooth finish. There were quite a few gaps which needed filling. To keep things neat, I surrounded the areas with masking tape. Deluxe Materials Perfect Plastic Putty was used to fill the gaps. It's great stuff that is easy to work with and dries with an excellent smooth finish. Once the putty had dried, it was shaped and sanded down. Some of the panel lines had been lost because of the sanding and needed rescoring. I used a strip of Dymo tape, secured in place with masking tape, as a guide for my Tamiya scriber. I pressed lightly and went over each line several times. The result from the scriber was amazing, and it was quite easy to use once the Dymo tape guide was in place. I definitely recommend getting this equipment for rescribing panel lines. The lines on the underside were difficult to do because I couldn't stick the Dymo tape to the curve of the fuselage. I found that using blue tack or Plasti-Tack to support the tape worked quite well. Sometimes I did slip with the scriber, and these mistakes were later filled with perfect plastic putty and sanded down. I rescribed some of the lines along the leading edges of the wings. The engine lacked crisp moulded detail, but thankfully you can't see much of it once the model is assembled. I know that more detailed, resin aftermarket replacements are available if you want better moulding. Construction of the engine cowling was pretty flimsy, and I had to be very careful that it dried in the correct position. I glued the wing struts to the fuselage, using the wing as a guide, but I didn't glue the wing on. By keeping the wing separate, it made painting the model easier. More detail could have been further added to the model if I had drilled out those teardrop shapes on the engine cover. However, I didn't think I would do a very good job of it. Tail planes were added. Note that there is a small gap above them which the instructions tell you not to fill. Before the glue had fully dried, I attached the supports to make sure they dried at the correct angles. I stuffed the cockpit with cotton wool to protect it from the painting. However, this wasn't the best idea as it got fibres all over the model. The small handles were added. A more advanced modeller may choose to drill out holes and create finer handles from wire. The propeller and spinner was constructed. The blades had some deformities in them which I filled with perfect plastic putty and sanded smooth. I cut in at an angle along the ailerons to make them look separate from the main wing. BUDZIK uses this technique in a video, to which there is a link in the description and in the cards. Once this was done, the model was ready for a coat of primer. The entire model was sprayed with a coat of Humbrol acrylic primer. This revealed a few more imperfections in the moulding or mistakes I had made with the Tamiya scriber, so I filled them with perfect plastic putty and sanded them smooth. I mixed Vallejo model colour 873 US Field Drab to a ratio of roughly 1 part water to 5 parts paint. I applied it with a wide brush in a direction from nose to tail. A smaller brush was used for smaller areas. For more information, check out my video on how to brush paint scale models. There's a link in the description and in the cards. A second coat of Vallejo US Field Drab was applied, thin to the same ratio. It was my first experience using Vallejo paints, and I really loved working with them. Also, the finish you get from them is great. 2 coats of Vallejo 906 Pale Blue were applied to the underside of the wings, again mixed to the same ratio. Small areas were touched up with a very fine brush and thinned paint from a wet palette. The metal radiator grille required sanding down by 3mm, so I did this with a large metal file. The propeller blades and radiator were painted with Humbrol 85 satin coal black. The radio version, which is the one I'm building, required this part to be cut down to 3mm. I took about 1mm off with my scalpel. This cutting mat was kindly provided by Models for Heroes, a charity providing modelling materials and kits to health centres in the UK. There's a link in the description to their website if you want to find out more and show them some support. Paint was removed from the contact area and the part was glued in place. The photo etch parts had been primed with brass primer and then painted while they were still on the brass sprue. I attached them with a small amount of superglue. The engine was painted with an aluminium colour and then given a dark wash. I touched up some of the areas of the paintwork with a fine brush. The tyres were rounded, so to make it look like the plane was putting some weight onto them, I constructed a sanding platform which allowed me to sand them at the correct angle. The exhaust ring should have been painted with Humbrol satin brown or Vallejo cavalry brown, but I didn't have these colours, so I used Humbrol 55 bronze mixed with Humbrol 160 German red brown. Looking at it now, I shouldn't have added the bronze colour to the mix. Leather areas were painted with Humbrol 10 service brown, and the headrest was attached. The radiator was glued in place with superglue. I decided to test Paul BUDZIK's method of decal application. There's a link to his excellent video in the description. I used an 8000 grade micro mesh cloth to polish the paintwork rather than applying a gloss coat. Using a strip of Dymo tape as a straight edge, or doing it freehand for curves, I scored the decal along the edge of the printing, just deep enough to cut through the clear film that surrounds the printed colour, but not deep enough to cut through the transfer paper. The decals were then soaked in warm water until they began to slide. Placing the decal on my mat, I brushed off the excess clear film that had been cut through with my scalpel. Microset decal solution was applied to the model and the decals were slid off the paper into place. I found that the decals were satisfactory. I thought that the printing could have been sharper. Cutting out the clear squares from the Polish Airforce checkerboard made the decal weak and I had to apply them one half at a time. This was difficult but well worth it. If I had left the clear film in place, it would have possibly silvered or not conformed to the model well, resulting in a loss of detail. I just had to be very careful and patient. After the decals had dried, I applied a coat of microsol decal solution. I let it work for a minute, then pressed on the decal carefully with a damp cloth, then applied another coat of decal solution. This was to help the decals further conform to the surface of the model. I was struggling with the decals on the underside of the wings due to the difficult surface. Even after repeating the process, they still weren't perfect. I decided to cut along the ridges with my scalpel, then apply more decal solution. This helped allow the decals to conform, but left cracks which had to be painted in. Once all the decals were dry, I applied a thin layer of Humbrol matte coat to protect them from damage. I had heard of people having problems with this product turning white, so to avoid this, I gave the liquid a good shake and stir and warmed it in a warm water bath. While the liquid was still warm, I applied it thinly to the model. Apparently Humbrol matte coat can be thinned with enamel thinners, but I didn't want to add thinners in case they damaged the decals. Tiny photo etch parts had to be folded with pliers and tweezers and then attached to the underside of the aileron with superglue. To weather the model, I chose to use an oil dot filter, using Wilder weathering oils. I dotted small amounts of colour over the model, using lighter shades on the upper surfaces and darker shades on the lower surfaces. The intention was to accentuate the highlights and shadows on the model, while creating discoloration in the paintwork. After the oil paints had been dotted on, I blended them with a brush and Wilder oil thinners. I think I should have been much more controlled in my approach and focused on doing specific panels or sections of the model. Although the discoloration ended up looking subtle, I discoloured large areas which I don't think looks to scale with the model, and hence the final effect is not as realistic looking as it could be. After the oil filter, I left the model in a clean environment for 2 days to cure fully. The canopy was secured on a piece of Plastitac or blue tack to make a handle and painted with 3 thin coats of Vallejo 873. Once it was dry, the paintwork could be neatened up with a sharpened matchstick. To bring out some of the detail in the engine, I applied a black wash. For the radio version of the P11c, radio wire supports had to be attached. I drilled holes in the wings and tail with my pin vise, then glued the parts in place with superglue. Once the superglue had dried, I thinned some perfect plastic putty with water and brushed it into the holes to fill them. After it had dried, a coat of Vallejo paint made the filler invisible. The machine guns were superglued into the wings and also into their slots in the fuselage. I masked the cockpit with cotton wool and the propeller blades with cardboard. The model could then be sprayed with a coat of Humbrol acrylic matte varnish. Using my scalpel, I cleared any paint or varnish off the contact areas, ready to glue the wing in place. I decided to use superglue rather than polycement glue to attach the wing. I glued it to the fuselage first, and then stuck down one support strut at a time. I used a cocktail stick to apply the superglue in an attempt to avoid any accidents. Watered down perfect plastic putty was painted into the holes for the gun sights because they were too large. The filler was neatened up with a damp cotton bud before it had time to dry. When the filler had dried, I drilled a new, smaller hole in it with my pin vise. Applying a small amount of superglue with a cocktail stick, the photo etch gun sights were now assembled. This was very difficult as the parts were so small and I had to be very careful and patient with the assembly. Once the glue had dried, the gun sights were neatened up with a fine brush. Holes were drilled in the landing gear and fuselage, ready for a section of stretch sprue to be glued in place. These extra support pieces were then painted black as a base coat for the steel colour that followed. Perfect plastic putty was used to fill the gap between the wing and the fuselage. I also had to build up the right side of the fuselage because the part was slightly warped. The canopy piece did not sit flat, so I had to even out the area with filler. Once the filler had been sanded and painted, I attached the canopy with PVA glue. I use PVA glue because it dries clear and does not react with the plastic. For the final touch, I had to create radio wires. I used those annoying stringy bits of glue that you get from a hot glue gun. I painted these black. Holding them in position with a clip, I applied a small amount of superglue and let it set. To make the Y shape, I held the wires together at the point I wanted the join to be with tweezers and applied a tiny amount of superglue. I removed the tweezers as quickly as possible to avoid the wire from sticking to them. One of the wires snapped, but thankfully I still had enough to work with. To attach the wire to the tail, I held the tweezers shut in a clip and stuck the clip down to the table. I then had both hands free to apply the superglue while the wire was pulled taut. After the superglue had dried, I cut off the excess very slowly and carefully with a sharp scalpel blade. When that was done, the model was finally completed. So overall, I think this was a good PZL P11c kit, however obviously it wasn't without its flaws. I think some of the moulded detail could have been much crisper, such as around the engine and some of the panel lines. I think there was also a problem with the flashing on the sprue, which prevented some of the parts fitting properly, but obviously the main problem was the warped fuselage half, which made the kit quite difficult to assemble. The photo etch parts were very nice and very much needed, and I think they improved the kit greatly. Painting this kit was super easy and the Vallejo acrylics applied beautifully over the Humbrol primer. I'll definitely be using those again in the future. I think that the printing of the decals could have been a bit sharper. If you look closely, you can see the little dots from the printer head, and it also took a lot of effort to get them to conform to the model. However, I think this was just because the surface was so difficult, and I don't think that was a fault of the decals. I'm very proud of this kit and it's allowed me to challenge myself in new ways. I've tested out a lot of new techniques and I feel like I've learned a lot from doing that. Even though this kit is a bit flawed, I think it's really nice and I'm really pleased with the final model, and apparently it is one of the best mouldings of a PZL P11c out there, so if you do want to make a model of one of those, I would definitely check out this kit. Due to the difficulty of this kit, I would only recommend it to advanced modelers. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.